Ketil smelled Greenland on the wind before he saw Iceland. It was the scent of damp earth and sheep, a welcome change from the sharp, sterile cold of the northern ice. The year was 1120. His Nar, a squat, sturdy trading ship, had been at sea for weeks. He was returning to his farm in the Breidafjordur fjords. He had a good cargo, walrus ivory, fine ropes of walrus hide, and a few white falcons for a Norwegian jarl. But his prize was in the reinforced wooden cage lashed to the deck. It was a polar bear cub, no bigger than a large dog. He had traded 3 bolts of good wool for it from an Inuit hunter. A living, breathing marvel, a creature of myth. He thought his neighbors would be amazed. He imagined showing it off at the local thing, the assembly where disputes were settled. He would be the man who brought a white bear to Iceland, but his nearest neighbor, Einar, was not amazed. Einar was a practical man. He had 2 small children and a flock of 30 sheep. He stood on the shore as Ketil's men wrestled the cage onto a cart. He watched the white cub pace and snarl. "What is that, Kettle?" Einar asked. His voice was flat. A gift from the ice, Kettle boomed, proud. "A white bear? You cannot keep it here," Einar said. "It was not a suggestion." Ketil laughed. "It's my property. I traded for it fairly." "It is a danger," Einar replied, his hand resting on the hilt of the small axe at his belt. "The law is clear. The Gragas is clear." Ketil had forgotten. In his excitement, he had forgotten the words written down by the wise men almost 100 years earlier, around 1117. The Grey Goose laws, the Gragas, were the law of the Commonwealth of Iceland. They were not the laws of a king, but of free farmers. And those laws, built on experience and survival, stated that no man could keep a live polar bear. The risk was too great. If a man brought one ashore, his neighbors had the right to kill it immediately. If the owner refused, the neighbors could kill it anyway, and the owner would have no right to compensation. In fact, the owner could be fined. The law did not care about marvels. It cared about Einar's sheep and Einar's children. And Ketil looked at the cub, then at Einar's hard face. He looked at his own farmstead, a place of peace he had just returned to. He had broken the law the moment the cage touched Icelandic soil. He had endangered the community without even thinking about it. That day, Ketil learned a hard lesson. A man's ambition did not outweigh his neighbor's safety. The white bear did not live to see the sunset. Ketil was not a legend. He was just a man who had to follow the rules, no matter how bizarre they seemed. Viking laws were like that. They were not abstract legal theories. They were practical, brutal, and intensely personal. They were designed for a world of small communities where your reputation was your life, and where a poorly maintained fence could be a death sentence. We look back at them as strange, but for the people who lived them, they were just common sense. And they are laws we would break every single day. Number 15, you can't just name your kid anything you want. Asa held her newborn son. He was small but strong, with a tuft of hair the color of wet sand. Her husband, Halfdan, sat beside her on the sleeping platform, his big, calloused hand resting on the boy's back. They were in their longhouse deep in a Norwegian fjord around the year 950. The fire in the central hearth cast long shadows. "We will call him Vindr," Asa whispered. "Wind!" It was a new name, one she had thought of herself. It felt right for a boy born during the first great storm of autumn. Halfdan smiled. He liked the sound of it. It was different. A week later, Halfdan's father, Kveld, came to see the child. Kveld was an old man, his face a map of wrinkles, his back stooped from a lifetime of farming and fighting. He looked at the baby, his pale eyes sharp. "He is a fine boy," he grunted. "He has the look of my brother, Torsten. You will name him Torsten." Halfdan cleared his throat. "We had another name in mind, father. We will call him Vindr." Kveld's face hardened. The air in the longhouse grew cold. "Vindr? That is not a name. That is a sound. A gust. It is nothing. There are no ancestors named Vindr. There is no luck in that name." In the Viking world, a name was not just a label. It was a connection. It was a vessel. for the family's luck and spirit, their Hamingja. Giving a child the name of a respected deceased ancestor was a way to pass on that ancestor's strength, fortune, and character. Well, it was believed the ancestor's spirit would watch over the child. To invent a new name, a nature name with no history, was seen as reckless. Well, it was an insult to the family line. It suggested you thought your own creativity was more important than the accumulated strength of your kin. "It is our choice," Halfdan said, though his voice wavered. To defy his father, the patriarch of the clan, was a serious matter. "It is a foolish choice," Kveld shot back. "You dishonor the family. You give the boy no protection. Do you want him to be a man with no roots, a leaf blown about by the wind?" He spat the word out like it was poison. The dispute simmered. It was not a matter for the thing, not a formal legal case, but it was governed by a law more powerful than any written code, the law of custom. The pressure from the community was immense. Kveld spoke to his brothers, to Halfdan's uncles and cousins. They all agreed. The name was an absurdity. It was a rejection of who they were. Halfdan and Asa felt the chill. Neighbors would visit and pointedly ask, "And how is little Torsten?" They ignored the name Vinder. When Halfdan went to trade for a new axe head, the blacksmith, a cousin of his mother's, gave him a hard time. "A man who does not respect his own father's wisdom cannot be trusted with good steel," he grumbled, though he eventually made the trade. The pressure was social, not physical, but it was just as effective. Your standing in the community was everything. It determined who would trade with you, who would support you in a dispute, who would fight beside you in a raid. To be seen as a fool or an iconoclast was dangerous. In the end, Halfdan and Asa gave in. The boy was named Torsten. When the naming ceremony was held, the old man Kveld held his grandson aloft, sprinkled water on his head, and formally named him Torsten Halfdanson. He gave the boy a small iron ring, an heirloom from the original Torsten. Everyone cheered. The crisis was over. The family was whole again. Today we search for unique names. We want our children to stand out. We scour baby name websites for something original, something that no one else in the kindergarten class will have. And we might name a child River Skyr Apollo. To the Vikings, this would be an act of profound irresponsibility. You would be breaking a fundamental law of kinship, the duty to honor your ancestors and bind your child to the protective web of family history. You would be choosing personal fancy over the spiritual and social survival of your lineage. Number 14, singing the wrong song could get you killed. Ulf the Skald had a tongue as sharp as his Sikhs. He could weave words that made men weep or laugh or draw their swords. He was respected and feared. He was a guest at the Hall of Jarl Magnus in the Danelaw, the part of England under Viking rule, around the year 990. The Jarl was holding a winter feast. The hall was hot and loud, smelling of roasted pork, spilled ale, and damp wool. Across the fire sat another Skald, Ketil Blacktooth. There was a rivalry between them. They competed for the Jarl's favor, for the best silver arm rings, for the most praise. That night, fueled by ale, the rivalry turned ugly. Ketil recited a poem about a famous battle, and in it he subtly mocked Ulf's courage, suggesting he was better with words than with an axe. The insult was clever, wrapped in praise for others, but everyone in the hall understood it. Ulf's face went dark. His honor had been publicly challenged. He could not let it stand. He stood up, and the hall fell silent. He began to compose a verse on the spot, but this was not a poem of battle or heroes. It was a nid. A nid was a specific and powerful form of poetic insult. It was designed to destroy a man's reputation. The worst kind of nid accused a man of being ergi, which meant unmanly, cowardly, or the passive partner in a male relationship. It was the most profound insult a man could suffer. Ulf's voice cut through the silence. His verse was short, brutal, and brilliant. It did not use direct language, but through powerful and obscene metaphors, it painted Ketil as a mare, a female animal ridden by another stallion. It was a devastating attack on his masculinity and his honor. The hall erupted. Some men laughed, but most looked on in grim silence. This was no longer entertainment. This was a prelude to violence. Ketil Blacktooth's face was a mask of fury. He had been socially castrated in front of the Jarl and all his warriors. According to the laws of the time, such as the Norwegian Gulathing law, composing a full, formal nid that accused a man of ergi was a crime punishable by lesser outlawry. The Skald could be killed on sight by the insulted party or his kin without legal penalty. Ketil stood up, knocking over his bench. He drew the long knife from his belt. "You will take back those words, worm," he snarled. "I speak only what I see," Ulf retorted, his hand on his own weapon. And Jarl Magnus slammed his drinking horn on the table. "Enough! There will be no blood spilled in my hall." But the Jarl knew the law. Ulf had gone too far. The insult was too grave to be settled with a simple apology or even a payment of silver. The next day, the matter was brought before the Jarl formally. It was a makeshift court. Ulf argued it was just a squabble between poets. But Ketil's kin stood with him, their faces grim. The words had been spoken in public. The dishonor was real. The Jarl, a wise man, found a middle ground. He did not sentence Ulf to outlawry, which would have meant his death, but he declared the insult was a grave offense. Ulf was forced to pay a massive fine to Ketil, a sum of silver so large it would take him years to recover. He was also banished from the Jarl's lands for a year. Ulf had won the poetic battle, but lost the war. His reputation was damaged, not as a poet, but as a man who could not control his vicious tongue. Today, we have diss tracks, online trolling, and comedy roasts. We see freedom of speech as a right to insult and mock. We might get sued for slander or libel, a civil matter involving money. But in the Viking Age, your words had physical weight. A poetic insult was not just offensive, it was an act of aggression, a direct attack on a person's place in society. Singing the wrong song, composing a nid, was like pulling a knife in a crowded room. It was an act you had to be prepared to back up with your life. You could, quite literally, be killed for it, and the law would be on the side of your killer. Number 13, your fence is not just your problem. Gunnar was a young farmer in southern Iceland near the river Thjorsa. The year was 1075. He had inherited his farm a year earlier, and he was struggling. His father had been a meticulous man, but Gunnar was more interested in stories of raids than in the tedious work of mending turf walls. His farm bordered the land of a widow named Helga. Helga was tough and observant. She ran her farm with an iron will, knowing that as a woman alone, any sign of weakness would be exploited. The boundary between their lands was marked by a long turf and stone wall. It was an old wall, and it was crumbling. The law as laid out in the Gragas was incredibly specific about these things. The legal boundary fence was to be 5 stones high and a man's knee high in turf. It also specified that each landowner was responsible for maintaining the half of the fence to his left when standing at the midpoint and facing it. Gunnar's section was a mess. His sheep, nimble and hungry, found it easy to scramble over the collapsed sections and get into Helga's hayfield. This was a disaster. A farm's hayfield was its lifeblood. It was the food that would keep the livestock alive through the long, dark Icelandic winter. Without enough hay, the animals would starve, and if the animals died, the family might not survive. Helga went to Gunnar. "Gunnar," she said, her voice polite but firm, "your sheep are in my hay. You must mend your part of the wall." Well, Gunnar was embarrassed. "I will," he promised. "I have been busy." He did not. A week later, more sheep were in her field, trampling the precious grass. Helga went back. This time, her voice was colder. "Mend the fence, Gunnar. This is your final warning. The law gives me rights." Gunnar, annoyed at being lectured by a woman, brushed her off. He was young and proud, and he did not like being told what to do. Helga did not warn him again. The next morning, she followed the procedure laid out in the law. She summoned 2 of her neighbors to act as witnesses. They went to the damaged fence. They confirmed it was Gunnar's section and that it was in disrepair. Then they rounded up the 10 of Gunnar's sheep that were in her field. According to the law, Helga now had a choice. She could hold the sheep and charge Gunnar a fine for their return, plus compensation for the damaged grass. Or, if the offense was repeated, she could do something more drastic. She could legally confiscate and slaughter the sheep. When Gunnar realized 10 of his sheep were missing, he stormed over to Helga's farm. He found her and her farmhands butchering his animals. The witnesses were there, observing. "What are you doing?" he roared. "You are stealing my sheep." Helga calmly wiped her bloody hands on her apron. "These are not your sheep anymore," she said. "They trespassed on my land after I gave you due warning. I have witnesses. I am within my rights under the law of the Commonwealth. The meat is now mine, as compensation for my ruined hay." Gunnar was speechless, he was furious, but he was also powerless. She had followed the law perfectly. He had been negligent, he took the matter to the local thing, but the judgment was swift and against him. Not only did he lose his 10 sheep, but he was also ordered to pay a fine for his negligence and to repair the fence immediately. The assembly looked down on him as an irresponsible fool who could not manage his own affairs. His social standing plummeted. Today, we think of property lines as our own business. If a neighbor's tree branch hangs over our fence, it becomes a long, drawn-out dispute, maybe involving lawyers. We would never dream that our neighbor had the legal right to seize and destroy our property for our carelessness. For the Vikings, a fence was not a private matter. It was a vital piece of community infrastructure. A weak fence threatened everyone's survival. Breaking the law of fence maintenance was not just a nuisance, it was a profound act of social irresponsibility. Number 12, you had to let strangers sleep in your house. The blizzard came without warning. One moment, Eric was walking the path back to his village. The next, he was lost in a blinding white chaos. He was a trader, returning from a journey to the north of Norway in the winter of 1020. He had been trying to beat the weather, and he had lost. The cold was a physical thing, a beast that gnawed at his bones. He knew he would die if he did not find shelter. Through the swirling snow, he saw a faint orange glow, a longhouse. He stumbled towards it, his legs numb, and hammered on the thick wooden door. It was opened by a large, bearded man who looked at him with suspicion. The man's name was Sten. "I am a traveler," Eric gasped, his words frosting in the air. "Lost in the storm. I ask for shelter." Sten did not look happy. A stranger was a risk. He could be a thief, a murderer, or just another mouth to feed in a lean winter. But Sten knew the law. The Frostaving law, which governed his region, was clear on the matter of hospitality. It was not just a virtue, it was a legal obligation. A householder was required to provide any traveler with shelter, fire, and water for up to 3 nights. Food was expected, though the quality could vary. To turn a person away, especially in a storm, was not just cruel, it was a crime. If Eric froze to death after being refused shelter, Sten and his family would be held responsible. They could be fined heavily, or in some cases even declared outlaws. The community would shun them as oath breakers, people who had failed in their basic human duty. Sten grumbled, but stepped aside. "Come in. Do not bring the storm with you." Eric stumbled into the warmth. The longhouse was a single large room, smoky and crowded. Sten's family, his wife, 3 children, and an elderly parent stared at him from around the central hearth. He was given a place near the fire and a bowl of thin barley porridge. It was not a feast, but it was hot. He was given a space on a bench to lay out his bedroll. For 3 days, Eric stayed. He was polite, shared stories from his travels, and helped with small chores like chopping wood. Sten remained wary, but he obeyed the law. On the 4th morning, the storm had passed. The obligation of hospitality was over. Eric was now expected to be on his way, or to offer payment or labor for any further stay. Eric thanked Sten and his family. He gave Sten's wife a small pewter brooch he had acquired in his travels as a gift of gratitude. Sten grunted in acknowledgement. The transaction was complete. The law had been fulfilled. This system was the Viking era equivalent of a social safety net. In a land with few roads and no inns, travel was perilous. The legal requirement of hospitality ensured that people could move around with a degree of safety. It bound the scattered communities together. It was an understanding that anyone could find themselves in Eric's position at the mercy of the weather and strangers. Today, our attitude is the complete opposite. If a stranger knocked on our door in a storm, our first instinct would be fear. We would not let them in. We would call the police or a social service agency. The idea of a legal requirement to house a random person for 3 nights is unthinkable. It violates our modern concepts of privacy, safety, and personal property. We would break this fundamental Viking law without a second thought, believing we were acting with responsible caution. To them, we would be failing one of society's most sacred duties. Number 11, declaring yourself divorced, was surprisingly easy. Thora was married to a man named Bjarni. They lived in Iceland, in a small farming community around the year 1000, just after the island had officially converted to Christianity. Their marriage had been an arrangement between families, as most were. Bjarni was a good farmer, but he was also a man with a quick temper and a heavy hand. He never beat Thora severely enough to leave marks that would be grounds for legal action, but he was cruel in small ways. He belittled her, shouted at her, and made their home a place of misery. For years, Thora endured it. But one day, after a particularly nasty argument over a mislaid tool, she decided she had had enough. Under the old Norse laws, which were still very much in effect, divorce was a remarkably straightforward process. It was not a court procedure. It was a public declaration. A woman could divorce her husband for several reasons. If he struck her, if he was unable to perform his husbandly duties, if he brought shame upon the family, or, in a famous and bizarre clause from the Gragas, if he wore shirts with a neckline so low it showed his nipples. This was considered unmanly and shameful. While Bjarni did not do that, his general cruelty gave Thora what she felt was sufficient cause based on the dishonor he brought to their home. The process required a specific ritual. A woman had to declare her intention to divorce in front of witnesses, first at her bedside, then at the main door of the house, and finally at the local thing, the public assembly. That evening, Thora waited until Bjarni was asleep. She went to her 2 cousins, who were visiting from a nearby farm, and brought them to the sleeping platform. In a clear, steady voice, she stood at the foot of the bed and said, "I declare myself divorced from the man Bjarni, for he brings me no happiness, and his anger shames this house. You are my witnesses." The next morning, as Bjarni was preparing to go to the fields, Thora stood before the open front door of the longhouse. Her cousin stood behind her. She repeated her declaration. "Before this house and all who pass, I declare myself divorced from Bjarni. He is no longer my husband." Bjarni was stunned and then enraged. "You cannot do this," he shouted. "I can, and I have," Thora replied calmly. The final step came a week later at the spring assembly of the local thing. People gathered from all the farms in the district to settle disputes, trade goods, and hear news. In front of the law speaker and the assembled chieftains, Thora made her 3rd and final declaration. She stated the reasons for her divorce. Her cousins testified that they had witnessed the first 2 declarations, and that was it. She was divorced. There was no argument, no trial. The law required the declaration, not a judgment on the reason. As long as she had followed the procedure, the separation was legal and binding. She was entitled to take back her dowry and her share of the household goods. She walked away a free woman, leaving Bjarni publicly shamed and alone. This ability for a woman to unilaterally end a marriage was extraordinary for its time. It gave women a degree of power and autonomy that would not be seen again in many parts of Europe for another 1,000 years. The key was that marriage was a civil contract between families, not a religious sacrament. If the contract was broken, it could be dissolved. Today, divorce is a complex legal process. It involves lawyers, courts, filings, and often lengthy battles over assets and custody. The idea that you could end a marriage simply by stating it 3 times in front of witnesses seems impossibly simple, almost comical. Yet, for a Viking woman like Thora, it was a powerful legal tool that allowed her to escape a bad situation. Any modern person going through a divorce would surely envy the sheer brutal efficiency of Viking law. The paperwork we would file would seem like a bizarre and unnecessary complication to them. Number 10, you were legally required to carry a weapon. Sven was a farmer, not a warrior. He was 19 years old, living in the Norwegian region of Trondelag in the late 10th century. His days were filled with mending fences, tending to his family's 2 cows, and helping his father repair the roof of their longhouse. But whenever he left the farmstead to go to the market, to visit a neighbor, or to attend the thing, his father would stop him at the door. "Where is your axe?" his father, Eric, would ask. "I am only going to the village. I do not need it," Sven would reply, and Eric's face would darken. "You are a free man, are you not? Then you will carry the weapons of a free man. It is the law." Sven would sigh and go back to fetch his hand axe, a simple, utilitarian tool that was as much for chopping wood as for fighting. He would also take his round shield from its peg on the wall. He felt awkward carrying them. The shield was cumbersome, and the axe at his belt felt heavy and conspicuous. But his father was right. It was the law. The Frostathing and Gulathing laws of Norway were explicit. All free, able-bodied men were required to own and carry a set of folk weapons or law weapons. At a minimum, this consisted of a shield, a spear, and a hand axe or sword. They were not just allowed to be armed, they were compelled to be. This law served several purposes. First, it was a form of militia. There was no standing army. When the local chieftain called the levy for defense or for a raid, every man was expected to show up with his own arms, ready to fight. A man who appeared without the legally required weapons could be heavily fined. Second, it was a symbol of status. Only free men could carry weapons. Thralls or slaves were forbidden from being armed. To be armed was to be a full member of society with both rights and responsibilities. Carrying your axe and shield was like carrying a passport and a voter registration card all in one. It declared who you were. Finally, it was a matter of personal security. The world was dangerous. Disputes could flare into violence quickly. A man without a weapon was a man at the mercy of others. The law assumed that self-defense was a personal responsibility. One day Sven was returning from the market when 2 men blocked his path. They were strangers, their faces hard. They had seen the small pouch of silver he had received for selling a goat. "Give us the silver, boy," one of them said, drawing a long knife. Sven's heart pounded. His first instinct was to run, but he had his shield on his back and his axe in his hand. He had been training with them since he was a boy, as all boys did. He brought the shield around to cover his body and raised the axe. He did not say a word, he just stood his ground. The robbers looked at his shield, his axe, and the grim determination on his face. They were looking for an easy victim, not a fight. After a tense moment, they cursed and backed away, disappearing back into the woods. Sven walked home, his hands shaking. He had never been so scared in his life, but when he walked in the door, his father saw the look on his face. "What happened?" Eric asked. Sven told him. Eric nodded slowly. He put a hand on Sven's shoulder. "Now you know why you carry the axe," he said. Today, we live in a world where carrying a weapon in public is heavily restricted or illegal in most places. Walking into a grocery store with an axe and shield would result in an immediate police response. We see armed individuals as a threat, not as responsible citizens. The Viking law compelling men to be armed is completely alien to our modern sensibilities about public safety and state-sponsored security. We would break this law every day simply by walking out of our homes unarmed, a state of being they would have considered naked and foolish. Number 9, you could pay a fine for killing someone. It was a cold spring morning in Orkney, an island chain north of Scotland under the rule of a Norse jarl. The year was around 975. 2 young men, cousins named Magnus and Hakon, were arguing. The argument was over a piece of driftwood, a large, valuable log that had washed up on the shore between their family farms. Both claimed it. Voices were raised. Pride was at stake. The argument escalated until Hakon shoved Magnus. Magnus, in a flash of rage, drew his knife and stabbed Hakon in the chest. Hakon fell to the ground, dead. If panic replaced Magnus's anger, he had killed his own kinsman. In the Viking world, this was a catastrophe. The expected response was a blood feud. Hakon's father and brothers were now honor-bound to seek revenge by killing Magnus or one of his close male relatives. This could spiral into a multi-generational cycle of violence that could destroy both families, but there was another way. The law provided an alternative to the blood feud Wergild, or Mon price. Wergild was a system of structured compensation. Every person in society had a price on their head, a value determined by their social rank. A jarl was worth a huge amount, a free farmer a standard amount, a freed slave much less. Killing a person was not just a crime against the individual, it was a crime against their family, as it deprived them of a source of income, labor, and protection. And Wergild was the payment intended to restore that balance and prevent further bloodshed. Magnus ran to his father, Olaf. Olaf was horrified, but he was a practical man. He knew a feud would ruin them. He immediately sent a messenger to Hakon's father, his own brother, proposing a settlement. The negotiation was tense. It took place at the local thing, with the Jarl's representative mediating. Hakon's family was grieving and crying for revenge. Olaf's family was fearful and desperate. First, the price had to be set. Hakon was a free farmer, a young man with his life ahead of him. The law codes, like the Gulathing law in Norway, had detailed tables for this. The base Wergild for a free man was a significant sum, often measured in hundreds of ounces of silver or in equivalent value, like cattle or bolts of wool cloth. Then there were modifiers. The killing was done in anger, not by stealth or ambush, which was considered more dishonorable and would have increased the fine. Because they were kin, the crime was more severe, which also pushed the price up. After much debate, a price was agreed upon 120 ounces of pure silver. This was a ruinous amount for Magnus's family. It was almost all their wealth. They would have to sell land, cattle, and call on their extended kin to help pay. The payment was typically made in installments, with the first major payment due immediately to seal the peace. Magnus himself also faced punishment. He had to publicly admit his guilt and express his remorse. He was also sentenced to a period of lesser outlawry, meaning he was banished from Orkney for 3 years. If he returned before then, Hakon's family could kill him without penalty. The silver was paid, the families formally swore oaths to end the feud. The peace was fragile, and there would be bad blood for a generation, but the cycle of violence had been averted. The law, through a financial transaction, had managed to substitute silver for blood. Magnus went into exile, and when he returned, he was a humbler, poorer man. To us, this system seems barbaric. We see homicide as a crime against the state, not against a family. The idea that a killer could avoid prison and essentially buy their freedom by paying a large sum of money to the victim's relatives is morally repugnant. It suggests that justice is for sale, and that a rich person can get away with murder. We believe in imprisonment as punishment and deterrent. We would never accept a system where a killer's main penalty was financial. This fundamental difference in the philosophy of justice means the Viking concept of Wergild is a law we would find not just bizarre, but deeply unjust. Number 8. A beached whale did not belong to you. It was a gift from the sea. A massive sperm whale had blundered into a shallow bay on the western coast of Iceland and beached itself during a storm. The year was 1150. For the farmers of the district, this was a lottery win. A single whale could provide tons of meat, mountains of blubber for oil, and valuable bone for tools and crafts. It was enough to ensure the entire community would feast for weeks and have fuel for their lamps through the winter. A young farmer named Ulfar was the first to find it. He had been checking his sheep along the coast when he saw the enormous dark shape on the sand. His heart soared. He ran to the creature and, as was the custom, struck it with his spear. This act, called the forfeit, did not make the whale his. It only established him as the finder. He knew he could not claim the whale for himself. To do so would be a grievous crime. The Grage laws of Iceland had an entire section dedicated to whales, the Valretur. These laws were incredibly detailed and reflected the immense importance of this resource. The law stated that a beached whale belonged to the community, and its division was based on land ownership. The owner of the land where the whale came ashore had the primary right. He was entitled to the head and the section of blubber directly behind it. He was also responsible for organizing the butchering and division. Ulfar ran to the farm of the landowner, a powerful chieftain named Thorkel. Thorkel immediately sent riders to all the farms in the district. Everyone was to come to the beach with their flensing knives and axes. It was a communal effort. When everyone had gathered, Thorkel, as landowner and legal authority, oversaw the process. The law was followed to the letter. After his initial share was cut, the rest of the whale was divided. The man who found the whale, Ulfar, received a share equal to that of a farmer who owned a boat. Then, every farmer who owned land with a border on that specific bay had a right to a share, the size of which was proportional to the length of their shoreline. Even farmers whose land did not touch the bay, but was within the district, were entitled to a small portion if there was enough to go around. The process was orderly and established by centuries of tradition and law. Everyone knew their place and their rightful share. A man who tried to take more than his due would be fined and shamed. If someone tried to secretly cut away a piece of the whale for himself at night, it was considered theft, and the punishment was severe. The air was filled with the sounds of chopping and the shouts of men slick with blood and oil. It was a festival of labor. Within 2 days, the colossal creature was reduced to a skeleton, and every family was hauling sleds laden with meat and blubber back to their farms. The law had turned a random act of nature into a structured community benefit, reinforcing the social order and ensuring everyone got a piece of the windfall. Today, if we found something valuable washed up on a public beach, our first thought would be finders keepers, or we might try to hide our discovery. If a whale beached, government agencies would immediately take over. Marine biologists would study it, and heavy machinery would be brought in to dispose of the carcass. The idea that the local landowners would have a legal right to butcher it and divide the meat according to the length of their property lines is absurd. We would be breaking Viking law by simply calling the authorities instead of grabbing our knives and calling our neighbors. Number 7, you could be outlawed for being too magical. Astrid was a woman who knew things. She lived on a small, isolated farm in a valley in Norway around the year 900. She knew which herbs could soothe a fever, which poultices could heal an infected wound, and how to read the signs in the weather. People in her valley were wary of her, but also sought her help. They called her a vulva, a seeress. She practiced a form of magic known as cider. The cider was a complex and ambiguous part of Norse society. It involved prophecy, shaping luck, and communing with spirits. It was powerful, but it was also dangerous and socially suspect. It was considered unmanly for men to practice it, as it involved a level of spiritual submission. For women, it was more acceptable, but it still placed them on the fringes of society. One spring, a sickness swept through the cattle of a wealthy farmer named Harold. Several of his best milk cows died. Harold was a man who looked for someone to blame. His suspicion fell on Astrid. He remembered that he had refused to sell her a lamb a few weeks earlier at what she considered a fair price. He convinced himself that she had cursed his herd out of spite. He accused her publicly of malicious witchcraft. This was a serious charge. The early Norse law codes, like the Gulathing law, made a distinction. Using magic for healing or to gain knowledge was often tolerated. But using it to cause harm, to kill livestock, ruin crops, or curse a person was a crime. It was considered a form of secret, cowardly murder. The case was brought to the local thing. There was no physical evidence, only Harold's word against Astrid's. Harold brought witnesses who testified that Astrid was strange, that she muttered to herself, and that she had been seen gathering herbs under a full moon. Well, it was all circumstantial, but fear is a powerful motivator. Astrid defended herself. She argued that she had only ever used her knowledge to help people. She brought forth others whom she had healed, but their testimony was hesitant. They were afraid of being associated with her, and they were afraid of angering the powerful herald. The chieftains at the thing had to make a decision. The law against malevolent sorcery was clear. If found guilty, the punishment was outlawry. This was not a prison sentence. It was a social death sentence. A full outlaw, a Skogarmadare or forest man, was stripped of all property and all legal protection. Anyone could kill an outlaw without penalty. In fact, people were often rewarded for doing so. An outlaw's home could be burned, their family driven away. They were forced to flee into the wilderness and live like an animal hunted by their former neighbors. The chieftains, swayed by Harold's wealth and the community's fear, found Astrid guilty. She was declared a full outlaw. The judgment was pronounced. She was to be gone from the valley by the next sunset. Astrid had to flee with nothing but the clothes on her back. Her small farm was forfeit to Harold as compensation for his dead cattle. Her neighbors, people she had helped and lived alongside her whole life, shut their doors to her. To help her would be a crime. She ran into the deep forests and was never seen again. She either perished from cold and hunger or was hunted down and killed. In our modern world, we do not believe in magic. A person like Astrid might be seen as a herbalist, a faith healer, or perhaps someone with mental health issues. If a neighbor accused us of killing their livestock with a magic spell, the case would be laughed out of court. We would be protected by laws based on evidence and reason. The Viking belief in the tangible power of magic and the laws they built around it are completely alien to us. The simple act of practicing alternative medicine or being a bit too eccentric could, in their world, get you sentenced to death by 1,000 hands. Number 6, insulting a man's beard was a punishable offense. Leif had a magnificent beard. It was thick and red, and he spent a great deal of time grooming it, often braiding it with small silver rings. In 10th century Denmark, a man's beard was far more than just facial hair. It was a primary symbol of his masculinity, his maturity, and his status as a free man. A boy was not considered a man until he could grow a full beard. To be beardless was to be a child. Leif was at a local market, haggling with a trader over the price of some iron tools. The trader, a man named Canute, was known for his sharp tongue. The haggling grew heated. Frustrated, Canute finally snarled, "Why should I give a fair price to a man who hides a weak chin behind a bush fit only for lice?" He then reached out and tugged Leif's beard. It was an incredible insult. The crowd around them gasped. To insult a man's beard was to insult his manhood directly. To touch it or pull it was a physical assault on his honor. Leif's face went white with rage. He did not draw his axe, though he wanted to. He was in a public market, and starting a brawl would get him into trouble. Instead, he did something else. He pointed a finger at Canute and spoke in a loud, formal voice. "I call all here to witness. Canute has insulted my beard and laid hands upon it without cause. I will seek judgment for this at the thing." This was not an idle threat. Laws across the Viking world took insults very seriously, and physical insults to a man's honor were at the top of the list. The Gragas in Iceland, for example, had specific fines for beard pulling. It was a recognized offense. It was grouped with other acts that shamed a man, like tearing his clothes or knocking his hat off. When the thing convened a month later, Leif brought his case. He had several witnesses from the market who testified to what Canute had said and done. Canute tried to argue it was just a joke, a bit of heated market banter. The lawmen did not see it that way. A man's honor was the bedrock of his identity. Without it, his oaths were worthless, his word could not be trusted, and his standing in the community was nil. The law existed to protect that honor and to provide a non-violent way to settle disputes that arose from insults. It was a way to prevent every slight from escalating into a knife fight. The judgment was against Canute. He was ordered to pay Leif a fine of 3 ounces of silver. It was not a huge amount, but it was significant enough to be a sting. More importantly, it was a public declaration that Canute was in the wrong, and that Leif's honor had been restored. The payment was not just financial compensation, it was a formal apology enforced by law. Canute paid the fine, and the matter was considered settled. He never insulted another man's beard again. Today, we would find this law hilarious. If someone made fun of your beard, you might get into an argument or post about it online. You might even get into a fight, but you would never think of taking the person to court for it. The idea of suing someone for beard pulling and having a judge award you damages is absurd. It falls under the category of trivial squabbles that the legal system has no time for. For the Vikings, however, it was no laughing matter. It was a direct challenge that the law had to address to maintain social order. Our casual insults and lack of reverence for facial hair would make us constant, unwitting lawbreakers. Number 5, you could refuse a gift you didn't like. Jarl Sigurd the Stout, ruler of Orkney, was in a generous mood. It was the year 1010. He had just returned from a successful raid on the coast of Scotland. To reward one of his key warriors, a fierce and loyal man named Thorstein, he decided to give him a gift. At a great feast in his hall, he presented Thorstein with a magnificent sword. The hilt was wrapped in silver wire, and the blade was of fine pattern welded steel. Everyone in the hall applauded. A gift from a Jarl was a great honor. It was a public acknowledgement of a man's worth and his service. Accepting the gift was a public pledge of continued loyalty. Thorstein took the sword. He examined it closely. He was a man who knew weapons. He saw a small flaw in the way the hilt was balanced. It was a beautiful weapon, but it did not feel right in his hand. It was not a sword he would want to trust his life to in battle. In a move that stunned the entire hall into silence, Thorstein laid the sword on the table in front of the Jarl. "This is a fine gift, my Jarl," he said, his voice respectful but clear. "But it is not a sword for me. I cannot accept it." A gasp went through the crowd. To refuse a gift from a Jarl was a dangerous and audacious act. It could be interpreted as a grave insult, a rejection of the Jarl's favor, and a challenge to his authority. But, Viking gift-giving was a complex social contract. A gift was never just a gift. It was part of a cycle of exchange and obligation. Accepting a gift, especially from a superior, created a debt. The receiver was now obliged to be loyal, to provide service, and often to give a gift of equal or greater value in return at a later date. This is why a wealthy man was known as a ring giver. His generosity bound other men to him. Because of this implied obligation, a man had the legal and social right to refuse a gift. This was a way to avoid entering into a contract he did not want. If a man felt a gift was a bribe, or that it came with strings attached that he was unwilling to accept, or even if he felt the gift itself was unworthy, he could refuse it. It was risky, but it was his right. Jarl Sigurd stared at Thorstein, his eyes hard. He could have chosen to be insulted and have Thorstein killed. But he was a smart leader. He understood the nuances of power. He saw that Thorstein was not being disrespectful. He was being honest. He was a warrior who valued function over beauty. And he was unwilling to be bound by a gift he did not truly value. Sigurd laughed, a booming sound that broke the tension in the hall. "Honest and proud," he roared. "You want a sword that bites, not one that just shines. I can respect that." He signaled to his steward. "Bring me the sword I carried in Ireland, the one with the nicks in the blade. It is not as pretty, but it has tasted blood. Perhaps that one will suit you better." The old, battered sword was brought out. Thorstein took it. It felt perfect in his hand. It was a true warrior's weapon. He bowed his head. "This I will accept, my Jarl, and my loyalty comes with it. Today, our rules of gift-giving are about politeness. If someone gives you a gift you don't like, you are expected to accept it graciously and say thank you. You might regift it later or hide it in a closet, but you would never refuse it to the giver's face. It would be considered incredibly rude and hurtful. The Viking law, which was really a social custom with the force of law, prioritized honesty and the understanding of mutual obligation over politeness. We would break this law with every polite, false smile we give when receiving a sweater that isn't our style. Number 4, trespassing was an invitation to be attacked. It was late at night in a secluded farmstead in the Swedish region of Uppland around the year 950. Olaf and his family were asleep in their longhouse. Their dog, chained near the door, began to bark frantically. Olaf woke instantly, grabbing the spear he always kept next to his sleeping platform. He heard a noise outside, the sound of the wooden bar being lifted from the door of his storehouse. Someone was trying to steal his grain. In the Viking world, there was no police force to call. Justice and security were the responsibility of the individual and their kin. The law recognized this reality, especially when it came to protecting one's home. The concept of the home peace or Heimfrieder was sacred. A man's farm was his sanctuary. The law gave a homeowner extensive rights to defend his property, especially at night. A thief caught in the act at night could be killed on the spot, and the killing would be considered justified. The law made a distinction between a day thief and a night thief. A day thief might be someone driven by poverty, and there was a chance they could be caught and brought to justice at the thing. A night thief was considered more sinister, a deliberate invader of the home peace, and the response could be lethal. The Olaf crept out of the longhouse, his spear held ready, the moon was bright, and he could see 2 figures by the storehouse. They had the door open and were filling sacks with his precious barley, the food that would see his family through the winter. And he did not shout a warning, he did not ask them to stop, the law did not require it. Their presence on his land, at his storehouse at night, was a declaration of war. He was the defender of his home. He moved silently through the shadows and drove his spear into the back of one of the thieves. The man fell without a sound. The second thief, hearing his companion fall, spun around. He saw Olaf and drew a knife, but it was too late. For Olaf was on him, using the butt of his spear to strike the man on the head. The second thief collapsed, unconscious. The next morning, Olaf followed the legal procedure. He did not hide the body. To do so would turn a justified killing into a secret murder, which was a terrible crime. Instead, he dragged the dead thief's body to the edge of his property, where it could be seen from the path. He tied the unconscious thief up, then he sent his son to the local chieftain to report what had happened. When the chieftain arrived, he saw the evidence, the open storehouse, the sacks of grain, the dead man, and the captured one. Olaf explained what happened. The chieftain examined the scene and declared that Olaf had acted within his rights. The killing was lawful, the captured thief would be taken to the thing, where he would likely be sentenced to be a thrall, a slave, for the rest of his life. Olaf's grain was safe, and his honor as a protector of his home was affirmed. This stands in stark contrast to our modern laws of self-defense. Today, the use of lethal force is governed by strict rules of proportionality and immediate threat. If you killed a person for stealing from your shed, you would almost certainly be charged with murder or manslaughter. You are expected to retreat, to call the police, and to use force only as a last resort to prevent death or grievous bodily harm to yourself or others. The Viking law prioritized the sanctity of property and the right to defend one's home in a way that our legal system simply does not. And we would break their law by dialing 911 instead of reaching for a weapon. Number 3, your relatives could be punished for your crime. Finn was a hothead. He lived in a trading town, Hedeby, in southern Denmark around the year 880. He got into a drunken brawl with another merchant over a game of dice. In his rage, he drew his knife and killed the man. Then, knowing the dead man's brothers would be after him, Finn fled. He stole a boat and disappeared, heading for the lawless lands of the Baltic coast. He had escaped justice, but in the Viking world, an individual was never truly just an individual. They were part of a kin group, a clan. The crime of one member brought shame and responsibility upon the entire family. The dead merchant's family, unable to get their revenge on Finn, went to the Thing. They demanded justice. Since Finn was gone, the law allowed them to seek redress from his closest male relatives, his father, an old man named Harold, and his two brothers, Rolf and Sten. Harald, Rolf, and Sten had had nothing to do with the killing. They were respectable men, but that did not matter. They were Finn's kin. They had a legal and social responsibility for his actions. The law saw this in two ways. First, the family was responsible for policing its own members. They should have raised Finn better or controlled his temper. His failure was, in part, their failure. Second, the concept of collective responsibility ensured that justice was served one way or another. It was a powerful incentive for families to keep their more volatile members in line. The dead man's family demanded Wurgild, the man price, for their slain kinsman. Since Finn was not there to pay it, the debt fell to Harold and his other sons. The amount was huge, the standard price for a free merchant. It would cripple the family financially. Harold stood before the assembly and argued that they should not have to pay for Finn's crime. "He is a fool and an outlaw," he declared. "He is no longer our kin." But it wasn't that simple. To formally disown a family member was a serious legal process that had to be done before they committed a crime, not after. Harald, Rolf, and Sten were stuck. The assembly ruled that they had to pay. They were given a year to produce the full amount in silver and goods. The judgment was a disaster for the family. They had to sell a portion of their land. Rolf had to sell his share in a trading ship. Sten had to part with his wife's silver jewelry. They were shamed and impoverished, all because of their brother's drunken rage. The law of kin responsibility also worked in reverse. If one of them had been killed, the entire family would have been legally obligated to seek revenge or demand Wurgild. The clan was the basic unit of society for both crime and punishment. This idea is completely contrary to modern Western law. Our system is built on the principle of individual responsibility. You are responsible for your own actions and no one else's. The idea that you could be fined, imprisoned, or have your property seized because of something your sibling or cousin did is unthinkable. It violates our most basic notions of justice and fairness. We believe that guilt is personal, not familial. Every day, by not being held accountable for our relatives' traffic tickets or bad debts, we are living in a way that would have baffled the Vikings. Number 2, promises made while drunk were legally binding. The Yule feast in the hall of Jarl Halfdan of Moor was a loud, boisterous affair. It was the deepest part of winter in Norway around 920 AD. The ale and mead flowed freely. The warriors and farmers in the hall were making toasts and boasts. This was the time of the Bragarful, the toast of promise. This was a solemn ritual, despite the drunkenness. A special cup would be passed around. When a man took it, he would stand and make a public oath, a boast of a great deed he would accomplish in the coming year. He might swear to kill a rival, to lead a successful raid, or to compose a great poem. These were not idle, drunken words. An oath made over the Bragarful was considered sacred and legally binding. It was witnessed by everyone in the hall. To fail to fulfill such an oath was a source of immense shame and could lead to a loss of status. A young warrior named Bjorn, full of mead and ambition, stood up when the cup came to him. He wanted to impress the Jarl. He raised the horn high. "I swear," he bellowed, "that before the next Yule I will sail to Iceland and bring back the head of Grim the Ruthless, the outlaw who killed my uncle." The hall roared its approval. It was a bold oath. Grim the Ruthless was a dangerous man living in the lawless highlands of Iceland. It was a near suicidal mission. Jarl Halfdan nodded, a grim smile on his face. He respected the young man's courage. The next morning, Bjorn woke up with a pounding headache and a cold feeling of dread. The memory of his oath came back to him. In the sober light of day, it seemed like madness. He was a good fighter, but he was not a seasoned hero. The journey to Iceland was perilous, and hunting a man like Grim was even more so. He considered just forgetting about it. Who would remember a few drunken words, but he was wrong. Everyone remembered. His friends clapped him on the back, wishing him luck on his quest. And older warriors gave him advice on how to survive in Iceland. The Jarl sent for him and gave him a new shield, a gift to help him on his way. His oath was now a public fact. It was as real as a signed contract. He was trapped. If he backed down, he would be labeled an oathbreaker, a Nightinger. His honor would be gone. No one would trust his word. He would be a laughingstock, a man whose boasts were empty. He would lose all respect. In a society built on reputation, this was a kind of death. So, with a heavy heart, Bjorn began his preparations. He gathered a crew, provisioned a ship, and studied the crude maps of the sea routes. He had made a legally and socially binding promise while drunk, and now he had to risk his life to fulfill it, or face a life of shame. He sailed that spring for Iceland, a victim of his own intoxicated ambition. Whether he succeeded or failed, his life had been irrevocably changed by words spoken during a party. Today, we do the opposite. Contracts and promises made while intoxicated are often considered non-binding. If you agree to sell your car for $1 while drunk at a bar, a court would almost certainly invalidate the agreement. The law recognizes that a person's judgment is impaired by alcohol. We make jokes about things we said when we were drunk, and no one expects us to follow through. For the Vikings, the context of the sacred feast made a drunken oath even more powerful, not less. We would break this law with every silly, forgotten promise made after a few drinks. Number 1. It was illegal to be a pacifist. Eric the Peaceful was a strange man for his time. He was a farmer in a fjord in western Norway during the turbulent 9th century, a time of constant raiding and local warfare. And Eric was a follower of the new Christian faith, which was slowly making its way into the north. He had learned from a traveling missionary that to turn the other cheek was a virtue, and that killing was a sin in the eyes of his new god. He took the teachings to heart. He refused to participate in raids. He refused to carry a weapon. His neighbors thought he was a coward or a fool. His chieftain, a hard man named Olaf Ironhand, saw him as a problem. The law of the region, the Gulathing law, was based on the collective responsibility of all free men to defend the community. When the war arrow was sent around, signaling a call to arms, every able-bodied man was required by law to join the levy, or Leidangr. This was not a request, it was a mandatory military service. A man who refused the call to arms faced severe penalties. The minimum punishment was a heavy fine. For a repeated offense or for refusing during a time of great danger, the punishment was outlawry. The community could not afford to have members who would not contribute to its defense. A pacifist was a weak link in the chain, a liability to everyone. One summer, a fleet of Danish raiders was spotted heading for their fjord. The war arrow was sent out. In village after village, men grabbed their spears and shields and ran to the assembly point. When the messenger came to Eric's farm, Eric politely refused. "I will not fight," he said. "My faith forbids me from shedding blood." The messenger was aghast. He reported Eric's refusal to Chieftain Olaf. Olaf was furious. At a time when the entire community was threatened, one man was claiming a personal exemption. It was unheard of. Olaf's warriors won the battle against the Danes, but several men were lost. After the fighting was over, Olaf dealt with Eric. He was dragged before the thing. "You refused the levy," Olaf stated. "You abandoned your neighbors in a time of war. The law is clear on this." And Eric tried to explain his beliefs. He spoke of peace and forgiveness. The assembled farmers and warriors listened in stony silence. His words were meaningless to them. They lived in a world where peace was a temporary state between wars, and where a man's worth was measured by his willingness to defend his home and his kin. The judgment was swift. Eric was found guilty of dereliction of his duty. He was fined an enormous sum, almost everything he owned. His farm was to be given to the widow of one of the men who had died fighting the Danes. Olaf told him, "You will not enjoy the peace that other men purchase with their blood. If you will not act as a man of this community, you cannot have the benefits of it." Eric was left with nothing. His personal conviction, his refusal To participate in violence had made him a criminal. He was Shunan. In their world, there was no such thing as a conscientious objector. The right to personal belief did not outweigh the duty to the group. Today, we hold the right to conscientious objection as a fundamental principle in many nations. We recognize that people may have deeply held moral or religious beliefs that prevent them from participating in war. While it has often been a difficult and contentious issue, the concept is protected in law. Eric's stance would be seen as a brave and principled one. In the Viking Age, it was simply illegal. It was a betrayal. We would break this most fundamental of Viking laws by simply believing that peace is a higher virtue than the obligation to fight.